Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi. Prologue. The God-centered community. At another level, the contemporary Arabic word for society, al-mujtama, is a recent construct and was not used with the same sense in the pre-modern period. It is a composite word invented to accommodate an understanding of the modern Western notion of society. In fact, the Quranic term for community, ummah, has often been used in juxtaposition with the term for society, implying, as it does, a community of believers. But here again, the term has nuances which go beyond the mere sense of grouping of people. The Quran refers to the Prophet Abraham as being an ummah in himself, in a clear allusion to the possibility of there being an identity between a community of believers and an individual perfected man. In Islam, the individual generates from within the virtues of the community and vice versa. So there is a continuum between the individual and the group, with little possibility of ethical atomization at the individual level or an oppressive conformity at group level. The purpose of the righteous collective and the individual ummah is one which enjoins the good and shuns the unlawful. This, of course, is the ideal. The reality is frequently perversely different, as when the moral police in Saudi Arabia and Iran go about their petty harassments under the banner of enjoining the good and shunning the unlawful. Nevertheless, the ideal has not been erased from the conscience of the Muslims. In the language of Islam, the simple affirmation, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there is no independent power or strength except from Allah, basically determines the parameters by which actions and decisions have to be measured. For Muslims, there is no escaping the consequence of such a declaration. It defines the individual immediately, governs his or her actions, and equally critically sets the boundaries and limits to the legitimate form and direction of such actions. Any collective of such individuals must follow along these very same principles. There can be no deviation from this affirmation and no let-up. This brings us to the notion of Tawheed, the spiritual mechanism by which individuals and societies can function in an integral manner by referring all action to the higher principle. A root principle in the worldview of Islam is that no individual or social group, if it seeks harmony and justice, can assume the absolute power to determine its own ethical standards of conduct. The operative phrase here is the qualification regarding harmony and justice. There are any number of ethical models and norms of morality and moral conduct which do not seek their justification in anything but reason, utility, personal desire, or natural rights. But Islam would venture that these cannot but be unstable. They lead to an incessant struggle between what is already established and what alternatives seeking its overthrow and the establishment of a new ascendancy. An ethical system of dynamic stability and justice must derive its coordinates from outside itself. Life must derive from the life giver, Al-Hayy, power from the power giver, Al-Qadir, and knowledge from the knowledge giver, Al-Alim. Only then can individuals and groups be guided and constrained by the only permanently legitimate form of authority. It becomes clear now that the claim for absolute autonomy for man in the design of his moral universe is in itself an invalid and false claim within the framework of Islamic reasoning. However, Islam would reject the notion that human dignity is in any way diminished or compromised when one acknowledges the absolute as the source of authority. Rather, this bestows dignity on humans and ennobles their actions. They are the actions of inspired beings, not the beings who move on the shifting sands of moral relativism. Certainly, constrained by the permissible is the only way of correct action for individuals and societies. Once God's authority is established as the indispensable source for the ethical organization of human affairs, individuals and societies can begin to follow a different trajectory for their development. It is clear of course, that in only very brief instances in human history, if ever, has this imperative of total submission to an absolute moral arbiter directed individuals and societies. But this remains the ideal, even if it is flaunted in practice. This condition has nothing to do with the so-called theocratic or even a religiously inspired society. Such societies more often than not surrender power to a priestly class which uses an elaborate theology to justify the all-too-human basis for its order. But it has everything to do with a virtuous society in which individual action is built on a profoundly ethical foundation derived from absolute moral archetypes. This necessarily brings us to a problematic and frequently contentious issue, which has bedeviled Islamic history even in modern times. How can ethical designs and commands, which are anchored in Islam's affirmation of man's dependency on God, be reliably transmitted? How is one to determine the truth and authenticity? God cannot be known directly. It is a feature of dependency that the dependent is always in a subordinate role. But there cannot be a value system determined by God if there is no reliable way of understanding its decrees and rules of conduct and action. Islam postulates two essential ways of comprehending the divine plan. The first is based on reason. Man uses his intellectual resources to understand and then utilize God's decrees so as to establish a moral order which will guide individuals and order societies. In many ways, though, a reason-based method cannot be valid at all times. In itself, it would be subject to varying interpretation determined by historical, social, and cultural contexts. While there may be alternative readings of the divine text, there are nevertheless limits beyond which Islam will not acknowledge a purely reason-based outcome. First, principles are immutable. Murder will always be murder. Theft will always be theft. There is no room for relativism in the acceptance of first principles. Even schools within Islam that appear to acknowledge the validity of a reason-based argument in generating new understandings and interpretations of the divine commands narrowly circumscribe the ambit in which such reasoning is allowed free play. The second way of understanding the divine plan is through what has been called the revelatory experience or prophecy. In this construct, God encompasses all of existence. The signs of God are disclosed to man in endless forms and manners, both measurable and immeasurable. It is essential, therefore, for man to have a reliable and true method of comprehending and interpreting the signs which emanate from this reality. The purpose of prophecy is to provide this indispensable medium for understanding the ways of God. In Quran, God has chosen thousands of prophets to act as the bearers of this knowledge. Some are known, such as Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Others are not. The Quran privileges some prophets over the others, but they all fulfill the essential function of being reliable and trustworthy bearers of the truth to their own people and to mankind at large. Most ethical systems which purport to rely on the sacred fall down at this point. The need for an intermediary to carry the signs and signals which allow the individual and society to relate to the absolute raises the thorny issue of what is true, reliable, and effective medium. In short, how does man know that the medium through which such an approach will be made is authentic? Ultimately, the purpose of all religions is to make intelligible the ways of God at human level, but all religions have shown signs of deviation and atrophy. They become veils which actually hide the way of God. Nevertheless, at the core of all great traditions of knowledge and wisdom is a frame for reaching a true cognition of the decrees of God. This frame relies on the existence of a perfected human being who acts as a conduit for receiving and transmitting truthfully the message of being and of existence, and who realizes and confirms in his or her person the unfolding of the virtuous way. Such a person becomes the ideal model of behavior and conduct and is the standard by which actions, intentions, and states are to be judged. The prophetic model establishes its authenticity in a variety of ways, but none more potent than when the model is accompanied by inspirations drawn from revelatory experiences. These form the basis of textual record of the revelatory experience and confirm its authenticity. In this manner, the sayings and conduct of the Prophet Muhammad become the idealized form from which an ethically inspired life can be derived. The last factor necessary to complete the framework of a God-based and timeless ethical system in Islam is the assertion that human virtues cannot exist in isolation from their roots in the attributes of God. Thus, the panoply of human virtues, generosity, compassion, justice, clemency, and so on, must trace their origin to the divine oneness, where their essences are to be found. The meanings which infuse creation and all creative acts must relate to each other as well as to their origin. There are no human virtues as such. As one of Islam's greatest moralists, the Andalusian Ibn Hazm wrote in the 11th century, if you study the laws that regulate human nature and the development of different characters according to the mixture of elements rooted in their souls, you will surely become convinced that you have no merit from your own virtues, that they are only gifts from the Almighty. You should replace the pride that you take in your own virtues with acts of grace towards the one who gave them to you. Modernity and Islam. These basic principles of human and social organization have always been affirmed within the context of the worldview of Islam. The interjection of the divine in the ordering of human relationships continues to waft over the world of Islam, even if it is no more than the use of the ubiquitous inshallah, God's will, that accompanies any Muslim's discussion of the future. This notion has yet to be reduced to a figure of speech devoid of any positive statement about the world. Muslims, however, have been prone to assume that the virtuous community did indeed exist in the pristine world of early Islam, and to some extent human affairs have been seen in terms of the extent to which mankind has strayed from these founding principles. The contemporary Muslim world is almost universally contrasted unfavorably with the world of early Islam. This contributes to the prevailing sense of moral inadequacy that permeates Muslim societies whenever they are compared to the Medina of the Prophet and early caliphs. Modern Western society assumes a priori that this worldview can and should change. The permissibility of change and the terms of which change become the battlefield between the traditional and the modern. The conflict between the religious societies and the avowedly secular ones has also been described in these terms, but this division is false. Overtly religious societies are not necessarily synonymous with traditional societies in their concern for the transcendent. Their claims are frequently based on the partial use of a historical narrative or on the selective and incomplete reliance on a holy text. More often than not, they degenerate into dogmatism and then tyranny, caricaturing in their action their own lofty principles. Islamic society and individual moral conduct have moved away from the reliance on the fundamentals of the revelatory experience and the example of the prophetic model. In a number of Muslim countries, a dogmatic Scientism has driven the sense of the sacred away from the private and the public conscious. Even in apparently traditional societies which have survived into the 21st centuries, including those which explicitly acknowledge the extra-human basis of morality and ethics, a similar condition prevails. The accretion of alienating religious dogma and the gradual distancing of the spiritual from the quotidian experience millions of Muslims have led to a similar moral alienation in those societies which claim continuity with and allegiance to a traditional moral order. They have all been infected with a modernity which does not recognize the sacred in practice, but such societies nevertheless maintain the fiction that they do. The petrodollar states of Arab Middle East are a case in point. The result is not schizophrenia, but open hypocrisy between what people find to believe and what they actually do believe. The Islamic criticism of modern society relates partly to the gradual erosion of the fundamental moral basis of individuals and societies and to their replacement by a relativism that allows for a crude utilitarianism and mindless consumerism. The manufacture of wants and desires with little understanding of the true function of happiness, in particular, the absolute requirement that it should be shaped towards a meaningful end, has imprisoned the human self in its lowest common denominator. The self cannot break out of its self-made prison and is caught in a vicious cycle which condemns it to an incessant clamor of gratification. The function of the collective becomes one that seeks to assuage these desires while at the same time developing the demand for newer desires. The engine, what the political philosopher Bertrand de Jouvenel termed the miniature, crushes all in its paths and at the edge reduces human beings to machines of consumption. A coarsening of the human condition prevails even though it might be accompanied by a glittering materialism. Fear and anxiety, violence and aggression are the obverse to the modern ethics of desire rooted in the material. As the individual and more broadly societies contemplate the possibility of losing the means by which their desires are to be gratified. Islam's retort to this type of modernity does not on the surface appear to be much different from the arguments of all anti-modernists, including large swaths of the intelligentsia in the Western world itself as well as in other non-Muslim traditional societies. How does this reaction differ? One may ask, from the moral conservatism of the Catholic Church, the European New Right, the modern advocates of an ethics of virtue such as the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, or the Neo-Confucianism of the proponents of Asian values. The Russian writer and Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn presaged many of these concerns in his celebrated 1978 commencement address at Harvard University entitled A World Split Apart. The concerns of Islam are not too different, it is true, but Islam is theoretically the only force which can move beyond the polemical into the realm of the political through its explicit connection with the states and governments and thus with power. It can therefore create the circumstances to propose and even go down an alternative route into modernity. There are dozens of nation states which claim one way or another to be guided by Islam. These states could be active in defining other forms of modernity, but there are few signs that anything like this has been taking place. However, most, if not all, Muslim societies appear to have surrendered to the imperatives of the modern world, if not at the political level, then at least at the economic and increasingly cultural levels. Within Muslim societies, this process has gone furthest in the Arabic world, leading to a frightening bifurcation in the minds of the people and endangering the extremes of garnish opulence for the few and destructive nihilism which affects large number of disenchanted youth. There is no easy method to halt what appears to be an irreversible trend towards a permanent disjunction between the sacred and the profane. The rejection and acceptance of the unseen. Within the ambit of Islam's worldview, modernity and its fragmented successors are all seen to be part of the spectrum which is anchored in the formal rejection of the unseen as the basis for any moral order. But the issue is not simply one of confrontation between the modern mind and the grab bag of revolutionary states, global terrorists, and religious revivalists. The fact that mankind ignores, claims to refute, or ridicules the validity of the moral absolutes does not detract from their essential truth. Or at least that is what the traditions of Islam postulate. Whatever the outcome of the conscious rejection of this order, it does not affect the permanent existence of an alternative, more valid order. In this regard, mankind receives its just rewards by failing to adhere to the principles of right living. Man's progress towards the ultimate good can only be advanced through the correct interaction with the decrees of God. Felicity is an outcome determined by a correct interaction with these decrees. The person who focuses on the unseen must also engage with the here and now. There have been centuries of human civilizations whose axis has been other than the sacred. Notions of progress, modernity, scientific advance carry different meanings for those who continue to maintain a sense of the sacred. If societies and civilizations are to reflect a renewed sense of the sacred, their values must be radically rethought in accordance with the new sense of priorities in the organization of human affairs. This, of course, would apply in particular to Muslim societies which continue to claim a loyalty to and inspiration from the Quran and the example of the Prophet. It is not that Islamic civilization or cultures have reflected an abiding concern with otherworldliness. This is manifestly untrue. The concern of their rulers and elites has not been much different in substance to those concerns pertaining in other civilizations. Power and control, conquest and aggrandizement. The history of Muslims is littered with tyrants and despots, but the personal and to some extent the social spheres have remained outside the ravages of the ruler's span of control. Islam's spiritual landscape has continued to be firmly based on a God-centered perspective of the cosmos, without serious disruption by either temporal or religious powers. Knowledge of the transcendent has informed the lives of the multitudes in spite of the general tolerance shown for libertines and free thinkers in the history of Islam. The power of the mystical Sufi orders or tariqas and the spiritualized world of Imami Shiism ensured the centrality of the sacred in the private lives of people. Intra-religious wars within Islam were never as pronounced as they were in the history of the West. There is no Islamic equivalent to the 30-year war, at least in terms of its violence and duration, or to the long drawn-out struggles of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. The Mihna, a form of inquisition during the Abbasid period, were hardly occasions of mass slaughter, and where that did happen, as in Tamerlane's conquest of recalcitrant Muslim lands, it was due to marauding armies rather than campaigns against schismatics and sectarians. The closest thing, perhaps, to mass killings over a prolonged period were the successful campaigns in the 16th and 17th centuries to establish Shia Islam as the formal religion of Iran and the uprooting of the Fatimi Ismaili dynasty in 12th century Egypt by Salahuddin and his successors. Islam has had its share of terrorists and assassins. The latter are, in fact, a corruption of the dreaded Shashin, an Ismaili subsect active in the 12th and 13th centuries, but these were well outside the core beliefs of Islam. The imposition of the orthodoxies of whatever variety was not generally accompanied by coercion and mass killings. The recourse to the burning stake or to the debate was not an acceptable option in the tussle between various religious schools, aided perhaps by the absence of any formal church in Islam. Nevertheless, Islamic history does have its share of controversial executions of the unorthodox, such as the medieval mystics Hussein ibn Mansur Hallaj and Ainul Qutat, and more recently, and in the same vein, the Sudanese reformer Mahmud Muhammad Taha. Writers as diverse as the great medieval theologian Al-Ghazali may have bemoaned the Muslims' loss of spiritual bearing, but they never despaired of their potential for reform and return to the true path. Islam has its atheists, the Dahriyun, as well as its doubters and skeptics, but none could break through the ramparts of belief inside which the vast majority of Muslims resided, and still do. Hope and salvation, both temporal and otherworldly, continued to be seen in the context of spiritual architecture of Islam and not outside it. There was no renaissance or enlightenment in Islam simply because its trajectory was different from that of the West. There was no need of requirement to dethrone its perspective on the created universe and on mankind, because it was seen and believed to be true and real. The cosmos was held by the breath of all merciful. The revelatory experience of Prophet Muhammad was authentic and veracious. The textual base of the Quran was undoubtedly the word of God. Homo Islamicus, at least in the pre-modern period, was defined by the person's implicit trust in a divine order mediated at the human level through prophethood. The ordering of daily lives was built on this bedrock of certainty, on belief in an invariant scale of right and wrong, in spite of the dishonesty of individuals, the injustices of society, and the capriciousness of rulers. Not fatalism, but the sure knowledge that the inevitable divine justice would prevail. The individual who combined the sacred and the profane in his or her person may not have existed in an idealized form, but Homo Islamicus was as close a copy of this as possible, at least in Islam's self-definition. However, the worldview of Islam began to be seriously eroded in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was not only because of the retreats of the Muslim empires of the period, Mughal, Persian, and Ottoman, in the face of unrelenting pressures from the economically and militarily and technologically more advanced European powers, but equally importantly, because of the inability of the religious, political, and administrative classes to see the crisis affecting the Islamic civilization in any way except as the loss of power or weakening of religious dogma. The divisions within the Islamic world quickly hardened, pitching traditionalists against modernists, secularists versus revivalists. The pattern repeated itself from Morocco in the west to Java in the east. The idea of the nation state, which arose particularly in the 19th century, challenged the Islamic political entity. Sultanate and caliphate were contested by the political parties and by the modern military castes. Imama or rulership faced elected assemblies and notions of popular sovereignty. Extended families were threatened by shifting economic foundations and women's rights. The power of judges who ruled by Sharia had to concede to the new canons of secular civil and criminal law. The open marketplaces of bazaars, artisanship, and traditional exchange patterns gave way to the corporation in trust-based finance and foreign investments. The list is almost endless and all-encompassing. A new world was perched uneasily on the partial ruins of the old. Muslims would not quite abandon the past nor quite embrace the future. Their confidence crumbled as they reflected on what they had been and what had become of them. No wonder many thought that they had been abandoned by God. As Iqbal wrote, in grief while surveying this forlorn landscape. All we had lived for was battle. We bore the troubles that came, and we laid down our lives for the glory of your name. We never used our strength to conquer or extent domain, would we have played with our lives for nothing but worldly gain? If our people had run after earth's goods and gold, need they have smashed idols and not idols sold? Why on earth would anyone question and heaven forbid jettison this certain form of knowledge for a lesser and ephemeral vision? Why indeed? But this is what has undeniably happened.